Our final decolonization example from this unit focuses on South Africa. And we've looked at South Africa as it pertains to imperialism and consequences of industrialization. But at this point, as we kind of connect the dots here, recall that South Africa won freedom from Great Britain in 1910. But its government was controlled by a white settler minority that represented less than 20% of the total population. The black population had no political rights at all, meaning that their struggle for equality was from within rather than against an external enemy like India. So big difference between South Africa and India for decolonization. The white population was split between British descendants who had economic superiority and Afrikaners, or Boers of Dutch descent, who had political dominance. The term Afrikaners reflected their image as so-called white Africans, who were permanent residents of the country, rather than colonizing intruders. Afrikaners had failed to win independence from the British in the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, and despite the antagonism each side felt towards the other, both white groups felt threatened by any move towards black majority rule. By the early 1900s, South Africa had a mature industrial economy that was initially based on gold and diamond mining. But by the middle of the 20th century, secondary industries had popped up like rubber and steel and heavy engineering. By the 1960s, the economy benefited from major foreign investments and loans. But black South Africans were extremely dependent on the white-controlled economy. They provided the labor to urban industries and mines, but the collective threat of striking or simply withdrawing their labor would prove to be a valuable tool. Race played an enormous role in South African society, and the apartheid laws that were passed in 1948 were designed to separate blacks and whites in every way possible. The irony is that these laws were also designed to keep the existing economic structure in place that kept black Africans employed at white-controlled industries. The pass laws monitored and attempted to control the movement of the black population into the cities, and once there, they were again subject to blatant segregation. The rural areas were divided into so-called native reserves, or Bantustans, that were overcrowded and served to keep native Africans divided along traditional tribal lines. So the Bantustans can be seen in the image here. All right, so that's the emergence of apartheid, or apartheid, depending on how you pronounce it. So the African National Congress was founded in 1912, and like India's INC, it consisted of elite Africans who wanted a voice in society. It was also similar to the INC in that it was comprised of educated, middle-class men who did not want to overthrow the existing order, but wished to gain acceptance as so-called civilized men within society. Their appeal was to the liberal Christian values espoused by white society. For 40 years, the ANC was peaceful and moderate, engaging in petitions, conferences, and appeals to the authorities, even as more segregationist policies were passed. Women were denied full membership in the ANC until 1943 and were restricted to providing catering services and entertainment for the men. However, they took action in other arenas, including protests and boycotts. In 1913, they helped organize a protest against being forced to carry passes. And in the 1920s, rural women helped organize boycotts of local businesses and schools. When the Afrikaner-led National Party came to power on a platform of apartheid, it became clear that peaceful protest might not be as effective as planned. Now, during the 1950s, a younger generation of leaders joined the African National Congress, which included Nelson Mandela. they broadened their base of support and moved to nonviolent civil disobedience, such as boycotts, strikes, and burning the passes that all Africans were required to carry. These tactics certainly took their cues from the movement that Gandhi had spearheaded decades earlier. And the government's response was overwhelming repression, including the shooting of almost 70 unarmed protesters in 1960, banning the ANC, and imprisoning its leaders, including Nelson Mandela. At this point, the movement took a very different direction. With its political parties outlawed, underground nationalist leaders turned to armed struggle, sabotage, and assassination. They prepared for the guerrilla warfare by training in camps outside of the country. Opposition came to focus on student groups that were part of the larger Black consciousness movement. And this is a movement that tried to increase pride and awareness for this Black African majority and tried to mobilize women for this struggle. The Soweto uprising in 1976 was started by a protest in a segregated, impoverished Black neighborhood just outside of Johannesburg, and this was triggered by the decision of the government to enforce education in Afrikaans instead of using English. Hundreds were killed, and this was the start of the outright violence. By the mid-1980s, the government declared a state of emergency due to the continued radicalization and violence, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions organized a general strike of 2 million workers to commemorate the Soweto uprising. So these peaceful methods do turn violent once it's clear that the peaceful methods aren't really getting any desired results. Now, in addition to internal pressure, the South African government experienced international pressure to end apartheid. They were excluded from most international sporting events like the Olympics. They faced economic boycotts, many artists and entertainers refused to perform there, and the withdrawal of private investment funds served to isolate the nation from the greater Western world. This combination of factors led to negotiations with African nationalist leaders beginning in the late 1980s. They felt this was preferable to resorting to bloody violence to maintain their hold on power. Key apartheid policies were abandoned. Mandela was freed, and the African National Congress was legalized. Long negotiations led to national elections in 1994 that brought the ANC to power. Apartheid was ended without major bloodshed, and this really surprised most international observers. And here you see Nelson Mandela getting sworn in as President Mandela. Now, the main resistance came from more militant groups who rejected cooperation along racial lines. And this had been the preferred strategy of the ANC. A smaller group, known as the Pan-Africanist Congress, limited its membership to Black Africans. And during the turbulent 1970s and 1980s, young people who supported the Black consciousness movement clashed with supporters of the ANC and Mandela in the segregated areas of South African cities. There were also dissenters among the Zulu-based Inkatha Freedom Party. That's the Inkatha Freedom Party. And their leader had cooperated with the apartheid government and received funding from it. Thus, when the transition to African rule began, violence broke out between many Inkatha supporters who were Zulu migrant workers and the ANC supporters. Now, the violence never reached the levels as between Hindus and Muslims in India, and South Africa did emerge as a unified state rather than being partitioned. Such was the result with the creation of India and Pakistan.